Hello, hello. Welcome to season 5 of Lead Your Life with Debbie Heiser. My name is Debbie Heiser, and I help entrepreneurs make a lot of money doing what they love without sacrificing what's important to them. I see way too many business people letting their businesses or their jobs run their lives versus them figuring out with real clarity about what they want their lives to look like and having their job or their business be the conduit to have that life that they absolutely love. I want to thank you so much for listening in to season 5. This season is filled with motivation, inspiration, leadership, and wisdom from some super interesting guests, and myself included. My hope is through our shared experiences, you will see a bit of yourself and move further into leading your own lit up life. If you're enjoying this podcast, please feel free to share with others and leave a rating, and a comment or two would be awesome too. Let's get going. Thanks again for being a part of our community.
Straight from the corners of my mind is where I find my sanity.
Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Lead Your Life with Debbie Heiser. I am your host, Debbie Heiser. I help entrepreneurs make a lot of money doing what they love without sacrificing what's important to them. And I really do that by helping to build community and support amongst each other, as well as coaching and helping people both on the outer game part of it, like the tactical plans, the strategic plans, what are the actions that we're going to do? And then also on the internal game, like who are we being? Who do we want to be? What do we want our life to look like so that we can make the business be a conduit to that versus the business running our lives? So with that, let's start this episode. Today, I'm really excited. I have been kind of contemplating a couple of different topics, and you're going to hear both of them in the month of May. And the first one is about forgiveness. And I was just thinking a lot about this. I took a course in my master's program called Forgiveness and Restorative Justice, something to that. I can't remember if that's the exact name of it, but that is something towards that piece. And it's interesting. The month of April for me just kind of disappeared. I felt pretty lucky. I had gone over 3 years without having COVID, and I had tested multiple times because I traveled a lot and wanted to make sure that I was safe for my grandson to be around, and had never tested positive. And sure enough, the day after my birthday, which health is kind of the avenue, I'm working on integration this year and also my health. And so it was interesting how this happened the day after my birthday. And pretty much the whole month of April, I have been kind of out and not been really active on social media, not been active out and about. I've just been really fatigued, and my brain was having a hard time connecting things. And it really kind of kicked my butt. And so anyway, and I know everybody's had different experiences. Some, I've even had a friend that passed away, and everybody's had their experiences with it. But during this time, I started to do some more self-reflection. I had canceled a trip that I was scheduled to go to with some cohorts from Gonzaga. And we were going to a monastery or abbey in California to spend some good silent time, some self-reflection, as well as generative dialogue. And I was really sad to have missed that. However, I always feel like for me, it's God, the universe, whatever you want to call it. But for me, it was like, this was a God thing where I was able to be home. Now, there were certain days I don't remember because I slept all day and all night. But I've done a lot of self-reflection this month in April. And now coming into May, the sun is out, it's warm. And one of the things that kept continuing to come up for me is this idea of forgiveness and reconciliation. And so I wanted to share some things that have happened in my life and how, to me, it's layers. Like, I don't feel like we've ever arrived in something. It's just there's layers of things that we care for, layers of things that we expose, and not that exposure is a bad thing, but like expose and work through. And, the ability to be able to walk into the fear and deal with the emotional aspects of things is really something that I've learned later in life here. But I want to start by sharing a story that happened to me actually back in 2015. and a little bit of a story about the relationship that I have with my father and who I love dearly. Um, but it was interesting because I was digging through some old things, old papers that I had written. And there was one that I wrote on this relationship that I have with my father. And, when we see our parents and we're babies, our parents are like our godlike figures, right? Because we can't live without parents. We can't live without, well, we could live without parents, but live without somebody taking care of us, right? Somebody taking that role of a parent. And so as time goes on, we then create these pacts with them so that we don't make them wrong. And we have these messages. You've heard me talk about brain science before, and these messages come in and out, so on and so forth. So for me, a big message that I have received all of my life is how important family is and how important it is to stay connected to family. And we show up for each other when, and if we can't, like, we try very hard to show up for each other. And I'm not just talking like my immediate family with my son and daughter-in-law and grandson, but also my sisters and their families, and then my aunts and uncles and our extended family. And I was just taught that by my mother. And my dad, he's his own individual, and that's just not as much of a value orientation. It's a different family system that he came from. Not a judgment, just a different family system. And so back in 2015, well, let's back up even further than that. I don't know, those of you that are listening that know the story. So what seems like yesterday in some cases, and in other cases a long time ago, and as part of the urgency and the why that I have behind what I do, is my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. And in 2005, January 1st of 2005, she passed away. And it rocked my world, to say the least. And there's still layers that I'm continuing to grieve about and miss her terribly, as far as her physical presence, right? I've had too many things happen to not say that she's not with us, right? And so anyway, back at that time, and I was reflecting on this in this paper that I had written, that for some reason, when you're faced with tragedy, it can tear you apart, but it can also bring you closer together. And the 2 weeks that we spent in the hospital while my mom was in ICU and then eventually got her own private room towards the end of a couple of days that she was somewhat semi-coherent. Those were some of the most real conversations that I've had with family. And also in a setting where all of the little crap didn't matter. Like, we weren't taking things personally. We were there to support each other. And I mean, just the depth of love that came with that. And um, so there were a lot of really good things that happened with that. And so you're kind of asking maybe in yourself, what does forgiveness have to do with this? But you need some of that context to understand, because then we left the hospital broken, all of us. And in that brokenness, it was like, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like something burst and we all went our own directions. Like, here we were, this close-knit kind of family and peace. And I'm talking about my aunts that were there and my aunts and uncles that showed up, and like just friends and our pastor and people that just showed up, and we were connected. And then all of a sudden it felt like the world blew up, and all of a sudden we were all going in these different directions. And we were all dealing with our grief very differently. And at times, because we all have expectations about things, or because we're grieving in our own way, then we start to take things personally and our sensitivity meters are up, and so on and so forth. So anyway, this is just my experience. And what happened was, in a way, we felt like we lost our father too. And part of the awareness for me is that, in our family unit, my mom was the one driving like some of the value orientation around family. And again, I'm not ditching on my dad here. It's just a different, family dynamic growing up. And so, fast forward, And in 2015, by this time, my dad had remarried someone that he knew from his past, went to school with, and knew my mother. And there were a lot of dynamics that were happening, right? Like he was in this new relationship. We felt like we didn't really know who our father was anymore. It felt like he was resisting relationship with me. Felt like there was almost like this avoidance that was happening. And it took me a long time to realize that part of that was because I represented, there are pieces of me that are my mother. And the hurt that he went through, it took me a long time. Like this was not something that happened overnight, but it took me a long time to step back and think about the hurt he was going through. And did he always show up the way I expected? And I'm doing that in quotes for those of you that are listening, because my expectations may or may not have been what he was able to provide. And he was hurting and he was distraught. And, so it felt like in a way there was this exfoliation happening, right? And it was things that needed to happen. He sold our home that we lived in Kansas City since I was a freshman in high school. And, he sold the business that my mother ran while he was in corporate America. And just all these like different layers that he was shedding. And in order to move on, like I'm understanding, like in order to move on, we have to shed some of the old. And so, but at the time when I was caught up in it and felt like I had lost both parents and I didn't know who this person was anymore. And in some ways, I don't think he knew who he was without my mom, right? So anyway, I say all of that because it was really interesting when I was taking this forgiveness and reconciliation class that a woman who lived down the street from me that I didn't know that well called me one day and said to me that she had been looking for someone to have as a prayer partner. And I used to have a group at my church that we met once a week and prayed for an hour together. And that's just the way I choose to lead my faith. And so I had been kind of yearning for that. So I thought, oh, wow, this is pretty awesome, right? Ask and you shall receive. And so she and I started to meet and we started to get to know each other. And as we were getting to know each other, I found out and became aware of she was in a very similar situation. She had married a man whose wife had died of cancer. And his children were having a hard time accepting her. And she gave me a lens of understanding about my father and about his wife. And this understanding where she always felt like she was the other woman in the room and that she couldn't do anything right because of the comparison that was happening. And, it just gave me this understanding. And I don't want to go too far into that because that's her story, but like it helped me kind of put a different lens on to understand things. Now, it doesn't mean that I didn't get hurt. It doesn't mean that there were things that were done that didn't hurt me. But what happened is I started to look at too, that this idea of like looking at what he was doing, and I needed to just understand that he expressed the way he loved me in a different way than potentially I was used to. But it didn't mean that he didn't love me any less. It was so interesting because they drove up right after my then husband and I moved into our new house that we had built. And my mom down at their lake house, she had always wanted this dinner bell. And so one time my then husband and I were up in Amish country and found a dinner bell. And so we bought it for her and it was down at their lake house. Well, he actually brought that bell. He got it fixed and brought that bell up when they came up. And it was unbeknownst to me, and it was a complete surprise. And I realized that was his way of expressing and showing that he loved me, that he cared for me. I still have the bell. It's outside my house on a post. But the point being is I wouldn't have been able to have accepted that and understood his bid for connection had I not gone through this class and had I not met with this woman and understood things and seen things from a different perspective. So for me, forgiveness and reconciliation is about seeing things in a different perspective, and then also looking at what part of that do I own. So it's letting go of how I've been wronged. Doesn't make them, like when I do my forgiveness practice and I write down all the ways that I feel like I've been wronged, and I choose to forgive that. And then I choose to look at what was my role in that, because 99.99999, well, let's just say 100% of the time, there's something in there that I'm feeling goofy about myself that I need to uncover what I need to forgive myself for without beating myself up, right? So the question becomes like, how have I been wronged? I list all of that out. And by then offering forgiveness to that person, most of the time, just from an energetic perspective, I'm not condoning what they did. I'm just choosing to let go of it. And there's a flip side of this too, on identifying where I've wronged people and making amends for that. Right. And sometimes those amends are done in person, and other times I may write a letter and burn it to let it go. But either way, it's important to let that go. And because when I hang on to that, it's like hanging on to suitcases. And the more and more suitcases I hang on to, the more and more weighted down I feel. And then it gets in the way of relationship. The other piece to that is now shift fast forward to October of 2020. So this is 5 years later, and I'm still doing work around this relationship. And I realize that this very important concept that I can't expect other people to do or act or provide something for me that I'm not willing to provide to myself and or to them. Let me say that again. I can't expect of others what I'm not willing to give myself and or to them. So here I expected my dad to love me unconditionally, but yet I was showing up loving him in a very conditional way, hanging on to things that maybe he said or didn't say. Or, I just know with my dad, he doesn't call me. If I want to talk to him, I have to call him. Now, some people would judge that. I'm not judging it. It just is. He doesn't think about it. And interestingly enough, I kind of uncovered some things, because in October of 2020, I made a road trip and I decided I was going to ask my father about his life. I thought, you know what? I'm not showing up loving him unconditionally, but I don't know that much about him. His father died when he was 25. How did that make him feel? What happened in his family? He's the youngest of a gazillion, I can't remember, 7 or 8. I don't remember how many children. And so here's this little boy who is the youngest of all these people, and his oldest brother was the same age as my mom's mom. So my grandmother was the same age as my uncle. So I decided I'm going to show up and try to just show up in this unconditional love, ask about his life, ask how he met my mother and understand that story, ask how he met his wife now, and how that happened when they were younger. And so it really made me look at how I show up for others. And really thinking about am I expecting something of this relationship that I'm not willing to give myself? Because I can only change my behavior and how I respond, or hopefully not react to it. And so where do you show up for others? How do you show up for others? How do you show up for yourself? Do you have expectations of other people in a relationship that you're either not giving to them as well, or that you're not giving to yourself? As an example, I enjoy relationships that carry mutual respect, but do I respect myself? Sometimes we got to look at those things. And, there's other things too. Like when I think about past hurts, when I think about those things, the more and more I hang on to them, the more and more I'm anchored to being in potential feelings that I don't want to be in. So the question becomes, we can let it go. We just have to choose to do it, and then choose not to pick it back up. And sometimes we do pick it back up. And when we pick it back up, choose to then let it go again and learn more about it. Because as we walk into this, we continue to learn more and more. And so in some cases, I'm grateful for these experiences because then I know that I'm about to break through something. I'm about to learn something. And so I think about too, this idea of forgiving myself and letting go of this need to be perfect, because it's okay to say I did something wrong and owning that, right? Because this is the other side of forgiveness. Like I can think someone has done me wrong, but where have I wronged others? And where do I need to forgive myself for the wrongs that I did? And then how do I need to either approach this other person? And kind of the rule of thumb is about approaching people as long as it doesn't cause more hurt to them. And or it's not just to get things off my chest, right? Because then that's self-serving. But it's about how can I let go of my need to be perfect? How can I let go of then also and make amends where it's necessary and where it's helpful to the other person? So I'll let you kind of figure that out for yourself. And there's a quote that I'd like to leave you with that I found very impactful. And I know I didn't talk a lot about reconciliation as far as like the actual word, but a lot of my experience that I just shared with you is about reconciliation. It's about reconciling with myself. So therefore I can go reconcile with other people and create a stronger connection, which is a value point for me. And the quote is, it's actually my own quote. That's what I wrote in my paper is you cannot have forgiveness without reconciliation. And you cannot have reconciliation without at least a shred of forgiveness. And so think about where you might need to reconcile, because here's the deal. At the end of the day, are there things that my father does that drives me crazy? Are there things that his wife does that drive me crazy? Absolutely. But I have to look at that and think there's things that I do that drive them crazy. And really at the end of the day, right, wrong, or indifferent, I don't want to regret what little time I may have, because time is precious. I could, my father's 21 years older than me, but I could go before him. He could go before me. Whatever the case, I don't want to lose what time we do have feeling hurt and resentment. I'd rather feel joy. I'd rather feel peace with that and rather have some type of relationship. And the more I find I surrender, the more I find I let go, the more the relationship grows. So with that, folks, I'm going to leave you with that. Think about that without causing judgment, right? Like look with the lens of curiosity. You hear me say this a lot, not with the lens of judgment. And so if any of you would like to talk more about this, have a conversation, please go out to my website. You can find the link in the show notes and set up a clarity call. Let's have a conversation and dig in a little bit deeper. The more we dig into some of those areas, the more we can let go of them and learn from the process. So with that, everybody have a fantastic week and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for listening. The song Ride is co-written and sung by Miss Jackie Wilson and her collaborators Tyler Banks, David DJ Lee, and Chris Renee. And a huge shout out to them for allowing us to use this perfect song. Everyone have a fabulous week and I'll talk to you next week.